Danny. Welcome to the Pink Lady. All right, this film is being done by Danny Kaufman, my friend, and myself, and Dor, and with the express purpose of showing the family and also making sure that we have a living history of the house and our staying here. We moved here in 1990, if you want to walk with me. And we moved here with a purpose of restoring this house. And we had found it with thinking it would be an apartment house venture, and it turned out to be our living residence, and we've been real excited and happy about living here. But it is now 1994, and we're about to move on to another adventure, and the house will go up for rent, and we'll see what happens in the next chapter of our book. But one of the things that intrigued us about the house is a monument. It was registered with the state in 1984. The house was built in 1880, and it was built in what was then called Florence, California, and we think that's over by Normandy and Florence in that area, whatever. It was moved here in 1900. We're also part of the St. James Park Historic District, and we are also part of the West Adams Heritage Association, which is part of a community group that is into restoration and conservation in this area, which is called University Park. So welcome, come on in.
And before we go in, why don't we take a look around the outside, show where you were living, where this house exists.
Oh, do you want to take a panoramic view about where? Okay, all right.
You want to tell us what's the history around us?
Okay, this neighborhood actually is the joining area of the Adams area, and it was the Adams area was this prestigious neighborhood of the time in the 1900s and 1910, 1920. And the very rich had property in the Adams area because it was near the University of Southern California. And there's a whole history involved in that. The neighborhood's gone through a lot of changes, and there's now apartment houses and single-family dwellings, some dating back. There's been a lot of restoration, but there's also been a lot of dwellings that haven't been taken care of right now. They're doing a lot of restoration in the Department of Water and Power, which is down the street and owned by one of our friends, Anne Marilee Merle. And we also, by the way, own the house next door. And the house next door, which is called the Knott House, because originally the family that lived there, their last name was Knott. And he was a merchant. The family owned this house. The history, when it was in Florence, California, the history is that it was a farmhouse. And when the man died who owned it, Mr. Durfee, it was the wife decided she didn't want to have the house in a farming area anymore. She really wished to have the house in a more affluent area, and they own this land on this street. Toberman, by the way, which is on the corner, we're on West 24th Street in Toberman, and Toberman was one of the mayors of Los Angeles at some time. So I rather imagine he must have had property in this area. So come on in. You're going to see a lot of the things that were left in the house when we purchased it. You're also going to see some of the things that we've added. And since we've added many of the antiques that have been in the family and tell a story, I'm going to be talking to you about the family history, because like in every family there's usually one person who is the recorder, and that's been me. And as you walk into the house, you're going to see the restoration, a lot of the restoration that was done over a 12-year period. We bought the house when it was in probate. The brothers that had owned the house both died of AIDS, one right after another. But during that 12 period, they had engaged a lot of their friends in the idea that this would be a bed and breakfast. This house would be the place where people were entertained. The house next door would be where people slept. The wallpaper in here is quite incredible. This wallpaper comes from a company called Bradbury & Bradbury. It's up in Benicia, California, and it's very famous for its wallpapers. Wallpapers took off on the themes and were reproductions of wallpapers that actually existed at that time. This is called Fenwick, this particular wallpaper, and this part represents the land, and this part represents the water, and as you go farther up you can see the plants, and then as you go up to the sky, of course, or the ceiling, you'll see spider webs, dragonflies, and butterflies, which is the motif. I'm going to stop a second. All right, I'm going to take you into the formal parlor a minute, because in all Victorian houses, probably the most important room that you had was the formal parlor. I think probably...
All right, stop. So let's try that again.
Okay, versus the formal parlor. And the formal parlor in the Victorian era was the most important room, no matter what your economic level. You usually had a room set aside, and that room was for religious purposes. It was for baptisms, it was for funerals, it was for christenings, it was for weddings and whatever. And maybe Sunday afternoon would be spent in the formal parlor. So in this case, the formal parlor is over here. While we're here, I want to explain some things about the room itself. Again, this is the wallpaper in here is Bradbury & Bradbury, and it's a different thing. There's not too much to say about the thing. This room was designed, as was the front hall, by the Bradbury & Bradbury designers. The shutters, the window treatments were all here when we moved in, as was the ceiling fixture and the ceiling fixtures in most of the other rooms. The reason being is that when the people died, it was willed to the cousin of one of the brothers' lover. And this sounds tricky, but it is. So what happened is they came in and they gutted the house of all furniture and everything they could. And under legal requirements, you're allowed to take rugs and you're allowed to take lamps and all that things. Everything is movable, but they couldn't take the wall fixtures. Just a second. Okay, the wood itself on the doors looks to be mahogany. The house is built of redwood, but the doors themselves are painted over with a grain. And that grain painting and treatment is called trempe-l'oeil, which is a French word for fool the eye. And in the Victorian area, that was very classy. It was very in to make things look like marble, or to make things look like certain wood textures or whatever. In this case, you'll see that these doors, enormous doors, have all been painted over. I want to make a comment about the fireplace. The house is not heated. And again, in the Victorian time, the fireplaces tell a story. It was actually the beginning of gas heat. And there are gas jets throughout the house. And there are 4 fireplaces. This, you'll notice, is very shallow, as was the fireplaces in the newer houses, because they wanted to show that they no longer depended upon fireplaces to heat the house. They used coal, and we have used coal before, and it is somewhat effective, but generally speaking, we bring in room heaters, and that's how we heat the house. The pictures in here tell a story, and it might be worthwhile for us to just give you a background of who I am and my family. Okay? I was born in 1938 in Riverside, California. My mother's name was Lulu Marilla Winship, and my father's name was Newton Eugene Cattern. And there's two family histories that you will see in this house. And I'd like to talk about the pictures, but I'm going to leave the pictures to the very end because we want to make sure that we get them well lit so you can see the people we're talking about. This piece of furniture over to my left is a secretary that was brought around the Horn in approximately 1867. This secretary belonged to my great-grandfather, Jacob Newton, Jacob Calvin Newton. And Jacob Calvin Newton was born in Orchard Park, which is what at that time called Abbott's Corner, New York, which is close to Buffalo. And his family goes back to the before the Revolution, probably in the early 1600s, probably somewhere around 1620. And his family can date back actually to Sir Isaac Newton. And there's a very long family history about the Newtons. But this secretary was one of four, and there were four brothers in the family, and each one of the brothers received a secretary as a wedding gift. And it opens up, as all secretaries do, and it provides a writing space. It's been in the family for many, many generations, and when they came around the Horn in 1867, he was coming with his bride, who was named Mary Titus. And Mary Titus, my great-grandmother, was the daughter of Luther Titus. And Luther Titus is the one who originally came out here on my father's side for the gold rush. And I'll talk about him in a minute when we get into the hall. These are all from my father's side. So Mary Titus and Jacob Newton married, and he had been a captain in the Civil War. So when he returned from the Civil War and he married, or married before, I don't really know when, they followed my great-great-grandfather, for he had come home to get them and bring them out to California and settle them in the area near San Gabriel Valley. It was called Lamonda Park at that time, but it's now called San Marino. And they had a farm in San Marino up on Huntington Drive, and they also had a ranch. My great-great-grandfather had a ranch in Arcadia where they raised fruit trees of all types. And there was a ranch that was ready for my great-grandfathers, Jacob Newton and his bride, Mary Titus. And that ranch was to be called, I believe that might have been called the Dewdrop Ranch. I'm not sure because I have a quilt that will tell the story in a minute. But I'll show it to you. But what happened is that this ranch was over by Fremont off of Fair Oaks in South Pasadena, and they had a large holding of land there. And again, they raised crops and whatever. But both my great-great-grandfather, Luther Titus and Jacob Newton, were famous for racehorses. They bred and imported racehorses, and they helped start the Santa Anita racetrack, among other things. Okay, we're pausing a minute because we're focusing on some of the photographs that were part of the passed down in the family, which I put together in a collage and an arrangement so that it begins to tell the family story. This picture right here is Luther Titus. And Luther left his home, and there's his home in western New York, which is in Abbott's Corner, now called Orchard Park. And there's his daughter up above, Mary Titus. And over next to it is the cemetery plot, which is in the Roses Cemetery, which is one of the oldest cemetery and the oldest in that area. And there's a plot for 100 graves, so he was far thinking. This is in the San Gabriel community, the cemetery. And Patton, the General Patton, is buried next to him, not him, but his family, because he was from that area too. Luther Titus came out here in the gold rush. He traveled by ship to Galveston, Texas. When he got to Galveston, Texas, he started up through Texas following a wagon train. He had quite a bit of money in his money belt because as a young man he had gone to Indiana and he had worked in the coal mines there, and he bought a lot of land which he sold. He went back to his home where he was raised in Orchard Park, and he married Mary, or her name was Mariah actually, Benedict. And we don't know if he left Mariah when he came out to the gold rush, but the reasons were that she had red hair that's been passed down in the family and a terrible disposition. So anybody in my family who is graced with red hair always has to live with that. But he came out here in the gold rush, and he did. He didn't do anything really exciting on the way out. He did write a diary, and I have the diary that was written for the Buffalo newspaper. And the only thing he did was one day a bear came into camp, and he dropped his gun, and the gun went off and shot the bear, and everybody thought he was a hero. But that's about the only story. Oh, there one other too is that buckshot got thrown into the fire. I don't know if by accident or what happened, and it went off and it pitted his face. So when he came out to California, the first place he went to was San Diego, where he had to have the buckshot removed from his face. Sounded very painful. Anyway, he and his friend Salisbury went up to mine for gold, and they did. They panned for gold. They had an area which was theirs, a claim, I guess you'd call it. And when the claim began to run out, he'd made quite a bit of money, and he went into San Francisco, and he had a store that made roofing tiles. And of course, everybody was building, so he made even more money. So this is a man who made money all along. Then he decided, I don't know if he purchased the land in San Marino at that time, or whether he went back east then, and he went through the Isthmus of Panama, which sounds like a horrible trip to me. Went through the Isthmus of Panama, went back to western New York, and he stayed there for about 2 to 3 years. And we don't know if his wife followed him out here. There's different stories about that. Or if, but we do know that his 2 daughters, Clara and Mary Titus, did follow him out here. And that's when they came around the Horn in 1867. And Mary, of course, was married to Jacob Newton. Clara went on to be a nun in the Catholic Church, and I believe that was in the San Gabriel area. The picture here is the ranch house that one of the ranches that Luther Titus owned. He not only owned the ranches that I already discussed, but he also had a ranch that followed Monterey Road and went through what is now called Monterey Hills. And as far as I can tell, he owned a lot of Monterey Hills, a lot of land. And there's his old house that he left in Orchard Park. It's still standing, I believe. This house, this is rather interesting. This was among the correspondence that was in the drawer, and I never quite caught the connection because it's for a man named Drysdale, and it's a estate of David Drysdale. And David Drysdale's house looks very similar to Luther Titus's house in Orchard Park. But since then, I've learned through research is that Luther Titus had a sister he dearly loved whose name was Clara. And Clara married David Drysdale, and so they also followed Luther Titus out here, and they set up housekeeping, and their house is still there, and it's off Drysdale Lane, off of Huntington Drive, down in, I guess that's Monterey Park. I'm trying to think what the name of the city would be. It's near San Gabriel, whatever. Just south of South Pasadena anyway, that area in there. And this is Mary Titus as a young woman. My pictures of Jacob Newton are all upstairs, and you'll see those later. And this is the famous horse that he raced called Echo and won many trophies. This little boy is named Lutie, and for a long time I didn't know what the story was, but I do now. And what happened is that Luther Titus did something unmentionable at that time. He divorced his wife, Maria, and he married a younger woman. The younger woman, I don't even know how old she was, but I knew she was a younger woman. He was in his 60s, and she was from Saratoga. And Saratoga was the racing area, and some of actually Luther's horses raced in Saratoga, traveling around the Horn to compete there. And they had one child, and one child was named Luther, and Luther died when he was 4. And they said he was born without energy, but in the Victorian term of the word, without energy, I would rather imagine some heart deformed, possibly some kind of something that would make him very weak and possibly an invalid even as a child. But anyway, it broke my great-great-grandfather's heart. I just want to spend a minute to show you this picture. This is downtown Los Angeles, and this is in 1884. And for a long time, we had it blown up, but for a long time, I didn't even know the significance of this picture. It was only after I did history that I found out that my great-great-grandfather owned a lot of land in downtown Los Angeles. And I will say also that my grandmother did too. And this happens to be First, and this is Hill. That Los Angeles was not very settled at that time, and certainly not, you know, if you took a comparison picture from the same locale, I'm sure it would be fascinating to compare, because this, of course, you'd be looking at high-rises. But there's 3 X's right here, and it says these are my father's houses. So, and there's the church was on the same street. And so it's just part of the family history that's been passed down. Music room, and I don't know what, maybe the informal parlor if you were living here. The wallpapering here has been done by Bradbury and Bradbury, but on the ceiling you'll see remnants of what the house had at one time, and that was stenciling, which was very popular. And the stenciling was done by the 2 gentlemen that originally owned the house. Their names were Bob and John Dean. And evidently, I've been told that there was stenciling throughout the house, but what happened is that they discovered Bradbury and Bradbury wallpaper, and they wanted it to be totally glamorous. And so that's why there's so much wallpaper in this house. The piece over here, which is the carvings of the spools and the circles and whatever. And it's done to match pieces that are in the other room, and it was added from another house. It isn't original to the house. The quilt here is the piece that I love the most. And I guess the reason why I love it the most is because it's really woman's art, and it's woman's way of recording, and that was through quilts. This is called a patchwork quilt, as you know, and this is a crazy quilt, they called it, because there was no particular design. The fabrics on here came from her dresses, and this is again Mary Titus, my great-grandmother, and her sister Clara worked on the quilt as well. The quilt is a very specimen piece in that the stitchery is exquisite and quite unusual. All different varieties of stitchery are used on this quilt. And when I was a little girl, my grandmother had this border put on it, and it was on the settee, a velvet settee we had in our living room. And I found it very scratchy, so I just tore off some of the pieces that are on the edges. So I always think that's kind of funny. Here we've got this great quilt and then all these pieces missing because I decided they felt scratchy. I had it framed some time ago by people from the LA County Art Museum. At that time, they wanted me to donate the quilt as part of their collection because they have a prize collection, and I may still do that. The only thing I don't like about doing that is that you lose some of the history because it won't be so meaningful for some people. The ranch was called the Dewdrop Ranch, so throughout the quilt you see the dewdrops, you see the umbrellas, you see the theme of the quilt. This definitely has a theme. You'll also see that there are horses, pieces of fabric with horses. We know it's a California quilt because of the artichoke. Also, in every quilt that women make, there is always a place where they sign their name. And for a long time I couldn't understand why there was no initials, there was no name, there was nothing to identify the woman who made the quilt. And then I realized that there's the best way of identifying who made the quilt is to look at the pictures. Because this is the beginning of photography. These are really, really old. This is like the very beginning of photography, and these are lithographs on silk. So you'll see several pictures of women, all women, and all showing themselves. And I would rather imagine, I'm not real certain, but they do look like the same woman, that they're either my great-grandmother or my great-great-grandmother or her sister or whatever. So that's the story of this quilt. The picture over in the corner is a picture of my father, and that is the only portrait that I know of my father when he was a young man, a very young man. But this is the only picture I know of as he gets older. Now, as an adult, the only picture that I have is a picture with his fishing pole and a fishing caught and with a golf club and a hat. He always wore a hat, and the hat is actually hiding his face. My father never had a picture taken with my mother, and he never had a picture taken with any of the children. There were 6 of us. So I think it's kind of significant that he showed by his actions a very detached feeling toward family. But I think it was a lot because of what the bitterness that had been transferred from the family, from my aunt, his sister Mary May, and from his mother, who had terrible problems with her sister, who was named May. All right, this is the dining room, and this dining room is very, very large right now, but I have a feeling at that time it might have even been 2 rooms. I'm not sure exactly what the original floor plan was on the house. This wallpaper again comes from Bradbury & Bradbury, and this room was completely unfinished. We found the wallpaper in rolls in the closet, and we began to unroll them, and when we hired somebody to come in from the Bradbury & Bradbury company who had done wallpapering before, and he helped me measure out and try and figure out exactly what they had intended with the amount of wallpaper they had. So it took tremendous work. I would say about 6 weeks of work, and it cost $7,000 just for the labor alone. And I say that not to impress you, but to depress you, because I didn't think we were going to be putting so much money into this house when we got it, but that's what we've done. It was really I would say an effort of love in the restoration we have done. The wainscoting, and as you'll notice in the this part of the wall was actually, it was plaster. In the Victorian time, you might find, formed plaster. You might find it in tin, or you might see it also in leather, tooled leather. And this was done, the color and everything was done by my son Robert, who was an art student at Otis Parsons, and certainly contributed a lot to the effort and the work that's gone into this house. The colors are quite unusual, and when it came time to